All right, as they say, punctuality is the courtesy of kings and queens. So welcome everyone to the Winning the Challenger Sales Series, Getting Constructive Tension Right. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm your host, John Shea. As you can see, we've got a little discussion question here for all of you. What is your favorite Disney Pixar movie of all time? Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why on God's green earth are they asking me this question? I joined this webinar on constructive tension, this skill set that frankly I'm a little bit uncomfortable with. I'm not quite sure I know exactly how to use it. So we're going to give you a sense of why we're asking this and what we mean by this particular question. But as you're thinking about your favorite Disney Pixar movie, I'd ask you to think about also why. Why is it your favorite movie? Does it remind you of your own childhood? Does it remind you of a particular memory with your kids? I think what we draw from this is when it comes to your favorite Disney Pixar movie, it probably creates or elicits an emotional response for you. As you think about it, it makes you feel something. And that is what effective constructive tension does. So this is a thread that we're going to use throughout our conversation today. And think a little bit about if you were to associate constructive tension with a character in a Disney or a Pixar movie, which one comes to mind? My sense is that it's probably one of the villains. So think a little bit more about what this is going to be for us. And our goal today for Mike and I is going to be to get you to think about constructive tension, not as the villain of this story, but as the hero. So I'm thrilled to bring back my guest, Mike Randazzo. He's also the co-executive producer of this series. Mike, I see that you're on mute, so I'm going to protect you from the Zoom bingo to say welcome and thanks so much for joining me in this conversation.
Thanks, John. Appreciate you having me here. Happy to join, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. I think similar to John, in previous roles, I've led many a Challenger implementation, including training and upskilling sessions and workshops with sellers, marketers, sales leaders. And prior to that, I held several roles that required me to both lead and support all kinds of sales calls. So I've developed a keen eye for constructive tension. So that's why I'm really excited to be your guest, John, today. Talk through what it looks like, what it sounds like, what happens when you get it right, and ultimately what the cost of no tension is when we're unable to build it and maintain it in our sales conversations, especially in this environment. So thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. I know you and I are both on the same page. This is the date that's been circled on the calendar. We've been looking forward to this conversation. So let's not delay it any further. Welcome again to Getting Constructive Tension Right. If you're just joining us for the first time in this series, you know that to avoid any technology challenges, Mike and I record our conversation beforehand. We play that here to avoid any of those concerns, but also so that we can answer questions in real time. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn my video off. I'm going to mute myself. We're going to play our conversation for the next 29 minutes or so. We're going to come back, discuss some key takeaways, take any questions that you've got, and look forward to the conversation. Okay, Mike, let's keep the Disney thread going. I want to tell a quick anecdote about Bob Iger, chairman of the board at Disney, served 15 years as the CEO, had an incredible run there. He leveraged constructive tension at a very critical moment in Disney's history, where they were fighting Pixar tooth and nail. I mean, Disney had this long history of being an incredible animation studio. Pixar had come out, had hit after hit after hit, and had really started eating Disney's lunch in a way. So Bob Iger was looking to make a splash in his first board meeting with the Disney board. He was an internal hire. And it became clear to him leading into that meeting that the only option was to buy Pixar. It was going to be a multi-billion-dollar deal. It was completely against how Disney had done business in the past. But to him, status quo was untenable, and trying to build this thing back up from scratch was not going to be viable. So to convince the board that this very unpopular decision and costly decision was necessary, he prepared two things. He had a 10-year historical analysis of Disney Animation Studios' performance, which showed a $500 million loss across the last 10 years, and commissioned some market research to be done with Disney's target demographic, moms with kids under the age of 12, that showed they overwhelmingly preferred Pixar versus Disney. Meaning, when this target demographic walked down the aisle in a store, Disney items on the left, Pixar items on the right, they overwhelmingly were choosing Pixar. As you can imagine, when he brought this to the board,
that created some pretty healthy constructive tension in the meeting. And for folks that know the choreography and know Challenger well, you see rational drowning and emotional impact on full display. Put yourself in the shoes of Disney board at this point. Like, you're America's company, you're synonymous with childhood. You're now faced with this reality that you are no longer that company. Bob Iger didn't have to tell the board that. I think this did it on his behalf. So I tell this story quickly just to give you a sense of how Bob Iger did it. And for folks that know this story well, know that this changed Disney's fortunes completely. It changed their strategy, completely upended what they had done across the previous 90 years, and has led to successful acquisition after acquisition, Marvel, Lucasfilm, 20th Century Fox, and a 400% increase in the stock price for Disney over his tenure. So we tell this story to really set the stage for folks of what constructive tension can do. But you don't need to be Bob Iger. You don't need to be CEO of one of the world's largest companies to leverage constructive tension effectively. And that is what we are here to talk about. That is why we are here. So our roadmap for today, what it is and what it is not, what is the cost of not leveraging constructive tension, how can we get it right, and what are some practical examples of constructive tension throughout the sales cycle in the spirit of keeping this as actionable as possible. So really quickly, what it is and what it isn't. Again, Challengers, based on our largest B2B research study ever completed, high performance is driven by a set of key things, a set of key skills. You teach, you tailor, you take control. All of that enables you to build constructive tension, full stop. It's a force that's created throughout teaching, tailoring, and taking control to compel customers to act on an opportunity. Now, we've been doing this a long time. We train about 25,000 salespeople every year, equates to over 2 million over the last 10 years. And we see a set of key myths emerge around constructive tension. It's just another way of aggressive selling. It's a force created between us and the customer to make them uncomfortable. And it's used primarily during negotiations or to close the deal. And rather than Mike and I tell you that these are myths and show you or tell you the facts, we're going to show you over the course of this conversation. That's the goal we've set for ourselves. So I want to do a quick exercise with everyone on the line. If you've been through Challenger training, you're familiar with this constructive tension dial. It's a really useful visual to have when you think about a customer interaction. What I'll tell you is what you would take away from this is no tension typically equals no sale, full stop. Too much tension usually equals no invite back. So we are after that elusive constructive tension that must be managed throughout the sales cycle. That's what we're looking to create throughout this process. And people are really afraid of constructive tension, are really nervous about it, apprehensive about it, just given the misconceptions that we see here. So what I would ask folks to do here and now, think to yourself as many examples as possible of times that you, in an interaction with a customer, created too much tension, or you took it too far. Just to give you a moment, how many instances can you think of in your mind?
Not many.
Right, Mike, and I think that's what we see when we take away or when we run this conversation with sellers is you're probably struggling to come up with two, with frankly one, and you probably don't have any that you're really referencing. On the flip side, if I were to ask you, think about as many instances as you can of an interaction where you had no tension, customer interaction, dozens, hundreds, thousands, probably earlier this week or earlier today.
Yep.
So why do I tell you this? Why do I force you through this exercise? It's not as common as you might think where you create too much tension and you've never really taken this dial too far. So we've got to stop thinking about constructive tension as the villain and think about it as the hero, as what it truly is in this story. It's not Cruella de Vil, it's not Scar, it's a true Disney princess. It's a true hero of this story.
And John, I'll just add a quick point. I think the no tension is much more dangerous than too much tension. I think the point you made there was like too much tension. Can it happen? Sure. Once in a blue moon, an awkward exchange or a really tense negotiation, but like much more common is no tension, especially in this environment. And it's because of human nature, right? Like the natural response to a tense environment, a customer conversation is to try to find a way to diffuse it. You don't want to offend anyone or upset anyone. And the thing about this environment here in 2020 is there's plenty of tension to go around, right? And so the instinct, the reflex for a lot of sellers is to diffuse it right away. The ones who are going to have success are the ones who can recognize it, manage it, and use it as the productive force that it is.
That's right. That's right. It's in neither the customer nor our best interest to diffuse this tension. So that's going to marshal not just the individual stakeholder we may be talking to, but this organization. And depending on the size of the length of your sales cycle, the complexity, the size of your solution, your average sales price, like you need this to drive urgency. You need this to close deals to avoid, the 38% that end in status quo and no decision. That's well said, Mike. So I know you are ready to have a little fun with this, Mike, as part of this conversation. So this was, for folks listening, if only you knew what led up to us trying to figure out the right way to tee this up for all of you. But what I can tell you, what Mike can certainly tell you at the risk of speaking for you, is over the years, you and I, leading Challenger transformations, leading some of these sessions and upskilling across, all the major industries in North America, EMEA, APAC, you name it. There are two surefire ways, full stop, to just absolutely destroy and kill any constructive tension that you have in a customer interaction. So the first one I want to bring up to folks, frankly, is don't be a bad date. Now, there's a lot of ways to be a bad date. Let's be clear about that. But probably the most innocent way to be a bad date is to spend the whole time talking about yourself. You really want to have a two-way dialogue, engage, learn about them, they learn about you. So the question I would ask everyone on the phone is, think about the last interaction that you had with a customer. What was the breakdown of time that you spent talking versus they spent talking? I think the answer for the average salesperson, and let us know in the chat, is frankly probably 80 to 90% you talking versus the customer. And I think this is especially true, Mike, in a virtual environment where we're just trying to fill the noise and we can't read the cues as well. So we end up just being a Gatling gun of just spraying and praying our features and benefits, our functionality, you name it.
Yep.
The second one, which is perhaps a bit more obscure for those that know Tom Hanks's recurring character on SNL, David S. Pumpkins. It's this very bizarre skit, Mike, that you actually showed to me for the first time, where you've got some dancing, beatboxing skeletons, very long pause, to which Tom Hanks' character says, "Any questions?" And of course, folks that have been through Challenger training with us before have probably heard us say, the worst question you can ask in sales is what keeps you up at night. I would say the second worst question you can ask in sales is, any questions? And the third being, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're right, John. It's obscure. It came about as part of a, I guess, late night brainstorming session. But like, the point remains, this to me, and it's one that I'm still guilty of from time to time. Like, and I always try to be conscious of it, but it's a reflex. When you're done talking for a few minutes, it's a natural reflex to just ask any questions before we move forward. Like, to me, it's really dangerous. That's literally the most unproductive question you can ask as a professional seller. So that would be the one that I would continue to work hard to avoid, obscure reference aside.
Yeah, you and me both. And I think it's what utility does that question serve? It doesn't do justice to the quality of sales conversation, the quality of salesperson that your customer is talking to. I think, frankly, it's a throwaway question. And to your point, I myself am still guilty of it to this day. In fact, this morning, I asked a yes/no question. I stopped myself. There's an opportunity to be more thought-provoking, more engaging, inviting skepticism to really draw your customer into the conversation. So if we can kind of close the loop on this to make it really clear for folks that are listening, it's don't be a bad date. Focus on the customer, not yourself. Try to create an environment where it's a 50-50 split. And secondly, don't be David S. Pumpkins, whatever you do. Ask open-ended questions, invite skepticism. So I think the question to really drive this point home for folks is to the audience, and again, let us know whether it's in the chat or the poll that we'll launch on this, which of these are you guilty of? We're going to get into what we should do differently, but to make a quick point on this, frankly, as opposed to asking, does that make sense, or any questions, yes, you can think of an open-ended question that's thought-provoking and invites skepticism. We'll get to that. But one of your options, frankly, is just to not say anything at all. Leverage that critical skill of strategic silence, of a pregnant pause, that gives your customer an opportunity to interject. All right, so if we're doing our job as challengers, right, we have got to make status quo untenable. Now, as we talk through it, hopefully you're feeling a little bit more comfortable with it as a skill. But now, Mike, it's our job to really get folks to do something differently after, watching this webinar, engaging with us on this discussion.
That's the goal.
So let's see what we can do. We're probably still thinking, what if I leverage constructive tension? What's going to happen? What's going to go wrong? How will my customer react? Will I upset them? And we need to shift that mindset, Mike and I, to create some constructive tension within all of you, frankly. That this is not about what happens if I do this. This is about what happens if you don't. So our job, our imperative as salespeople, as we all know, we are agents of behavior change. We need to make the pain of staying the same greater than the pain of change. Full stop. And I think, Mike, the question here is, how well do our activities line up with this imperative of very clearly articulating the costs of doing nothing?
Yeah, and everything we're doing right now, unless you have the luxury of working for a company that has just way too much demand, it doesn't even know what to do with it, right? Like you're turning away deals. Rare instance, maybe Zoom is one of those companies right now, but in this environment, your job as a seller right now is to generate demand. And the way to do that is to find problems that your prospective customers are dealing with that maybe they've overlooked or underappreciated, that you can solve uniquely well. And showing them the importance of changing their behavior, moving away from their status quo, the pain of same, and move them in a new direction, a better way forward. Mm-hmm. That's it. That's the whole job. Show them that the pain of same is much larger than they anticipated or ever understood, and that it is way bigger than the cost or the pain associated with change, with investing in a new motion, with change management broadly, right? That's the key.
I think if I put myself in the shoes of the audience on this, Mike, they're probably thinking, yeah, I mean, I get it. Sure, I think I'm doing that. But I think we have to really ask ourselves, like, how effectively are we doing this? So are we focused on pitching change? Are we talking about ROI, features and benefits, case studies? Just to the point earlier, the show up and throw up, especially in a virtual environment, where you realize you've been talking nonstop for 3 or 4 minutes and you pull up and ask, right, any questions? Does that make sense? Or are we more focused, to your point, on deepening the pain of doing nothing, staying the same, the cost and risk of doing nothing, stories and anecdotes of other organizations that have faced similar challenges and had similar failures, frankly, and asking those powerful, thought-provoking questions that truly accentuate the pain of status quo? I think what we've seen is largely sellers are gravitating to spending more time, 80% of their time, pitching change, whereas really the opportunity is focusing more on deepening the pain of staying the same. And whether it's 80-20, frankly, or more of a 50-50 split, it's not 80% pitching change. That's not going to get you where you're going to go. It's really hard to create urgency. It's pretty difficult to differentiate yourself, especially in this environment. And there's really no clear business case on pitching change. Like the business case is on if we do nothing. So let's do some math here, because this hopefully paints the picture for you and gets you start to thinking about what am I spending my time on? And one of the things we know to be true is 38% from our research, 38% of all purchase attempts end in status quo or no decision. This is from our B2B buyer study back in 2019. If you do some simple back of the envelope math, so folks that have been engaged in this series with us know you're spending about 1 month of your working time on deals that you're going to lose to status quo. Full stop. And what makes this, I think, even scarier is when you look at that 8 to 10 hours spent on pursuit on deals we're going to lose, you might say to yourself, no, I don't spend the same amount of time or that level of time on deals that I'm going to lose. I deprioritize. I focus on the better fit opportunities for sure. They just don't take that long. What I can tell you, again, from our research is it takes the average organization, from a study we ran in 2016, 4.9 months to make a new purchase. Conversely, it takes in the average organization, the average buying group, 4.7 months to make no purchase. Said another way, it takes your customers the same amount of time to not buy as it does to buy. For folks that are listening, right, that are managing this, you know it's not just you. You know this is a broader issue for your team. If you're managing a team, you're on one, and for your organization. So in the spirit of doing the math on this, take those 20 deals that we showed you based on the calculator we outlined that lead to no decision, that end in no decision, excuse me. Multiply by the 20 salespeople that you have on your team, give or take, just for the sake of some back of the envelope math. That's 400 deals a year that your team, your organization is losing to status quo. Assume a $50,000 average sales price. That's $20 million in pipeline that comes in, that comes out, that disappears, that gets lost to no decision each year. And think not only about this $20 million in pipeline, how much should it cost you to generate that $20 million in the first place? The cost of sale, your marketing investment, the salary that goes along with this. Mike, I know this is something that you've been super passionate about as well.
Well, and that's the kicker for me, right? It's sort of the side note with the exclamation mark. It's not just what ends up going closed lost in Salesforce or in your CRM that didn't have to be a loss, right? There, you know, the percentage of deals that you lose to competitive situations, sure. Like in some cases, you're going to get outmaneuvered, but for deals that end in no decision, there's something we should have been doing. The more costly thing to me is the pursuit. It's, as you mentioned, John, it's all the time, energy, effort, overhead that you're spending to generate that pipeline, that $20 million there. All of that really adds up to a number that's probably a lot larger than 20 minutes in and of itself when you look across the cost of building it and pursuing it in the first place for 5 months, 4.7 months on average.
Yes, if we, and I think if we take the learnings from this, Mike, you know, we've hopefully created a sense of urgency for folks of, I don't want to lose as often to status quo. I don't want to miss the opportunities to leverage constructive tension to drive behavior change. So what do I do differently? What do I do about it? And that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time here together on. How do we get it right? So to connect the dots from the previous, a couple of slides ago, our imperative, our job is to make the pain of staying the same greater than the pain of change. And when we do that, we create untenable status quo that drives behavior change, that drives urgency, that leads to close won deals. Full stop. This is Challenger approach in a nutshell. Now, depending on where you're at in your journey as a salesperson, whether you're new or you're old to it, you're new to Challenger, whatever the case might be, there is a sense of maturity. There is a sense of opportunity, no matter how far along in the journey you are. There's always an opportunity to get better. So when you're first learning about constructive tension, you define it for what it is, this productive force. And once you've defined it, you look for opportunities to leverage it, to succeed at it, and frankly, in many opportunities, in many instances, to fail at it. You teach, you tailor, you take control that creates this force, creates this constructive tension. You leverage strategic silence. You examine conventional thinking, explore assumptions, ask those open-ended questions. But you know that this, to truly leverage it effectively, to get it right, it requires prep and it requires repetition. You got to be willing to go out there and take the at-bats. And to our point earlier, you've never really taken it too far. But there are plenty of instances where you haven't taken it further enough. So if everyone on this call can take that dial and move it incrementally, meaningfully to the right, you're going to notice an outcome. And as you work to really master this skill of constructive tension, you will create it not just at the end of the sales cycle, but throughout. You will become a better active listener. You'll pick up on cues. You'll understand what to look for. You'll leverage it in a rational and emotional way. It'll be empathetic, and it'll have the customer's best interest in mind as you build your credibility. You will be so confident that you invite skepticism, and it is delivered, frankly, with a strong sense of confidence. But that sense of confidence is only developed after reps and reps and reps of prep and repetition, of opportunities to really practice this and get it right. But that's not tactical enough. That's not the goal we set out for ourselves at the start of this series. So how do we actually leverage constructive tension in any interaction we would have with a customer? Here's our playbook. Here's our checklist of how to do that exactly. Now, if you've taken one thing away from this series, it's that challengers prep differently. Before you get on the meeting, you do your homework. You know the stakeholder, you know their motivations, you know what they believe and why. You've prepared, you're familiar with the content they're going to share. what they'll need, whether it's the RFP, it's questions they sent over in advance, it's your notes from an interaction you had previously, and you anticipate opportunities to leverage constructive tension and ensure everyone on your team is on the same page, or else you'll blow your opportunity to leverage constructive tension, strategic silence, and ask those key questions. All of this enables you to get on the call and know that gap, the current state, where you know that customer is thinking about things incorrectly, what you're going to reframe them on. That enables you to ask powerful questions, to explore conventional thinking and assumptions, to highlight the problem and the pain point that is unrecognized, misunderstood, or underappreciated. Once you've done that, you leverage strategic silence, you guide the customer to the new way forward in your solution through recommendations and guiding questions. And then you drive action, accountability, and next steps by leveraging powerful requests, what you want, why you want it, whom you want it from, and when you want it by. Last thing I'll say is be careful not to guide them out of the valley of despair and to the solution too quickly. We want to make sure they really feel the pain if they do nothing. Mike, powerful questions. I know something you're super passionate about, so I'd love for you to just give the audience a sense of why this is important, how to do this.
Yeah, as we were putting the checklist together here and just trying to think of, hey, what's a comprehensive yet manageable checklist for folks to use before calls in their prep and during calls to look for and find opportunities to build and maintain the right level of constructive tension. The thing that kept coming back was this idea of powerful questions. And it seems simple enough, like questioning techniques, that seems like basic training 101, right? But I'd say wherever you are as a seller in terms of tenure, experience, skill, asking great questions is just one of those fundamental things, and putting intentional effort into prepping those questions before a call. It's something that'll always pay off. I don't care if you've been in the business for 2 months, 2 years, or 20 years. A skillful rep with a strong ability to ask powerful questions can unlock doors that aren't typically unlocked or opened to most reps out there, right? The response you get from asking a great question should either lead you closer to an outcome, move you forward, or perhaps lead you closer to the ability to disqualify an opportunity, which we know is really, really important in this world of the 38%. Disqualify, cut bait earlier than others might, and you could save yourself weeks, if not months, of wasted effort on a no decision deal. So again, right. Powerful questions is where I'd focus a lot of time and attention as an individual contributor, and just preparing for and then executing calls.
That's right. And by teaching and leading with insight, creating that value and just demonstrating that credibility, we earn the right to ask these really powerful questions that make the sales experience even all that more effective and all that more memorable. In the interest of time, I know we want to get to the practical application of this. I think we're going to try and do this in about 5 minutes. So we're going to go real quick, rapid fire through these. So to our point earlier of constructive tension not just being leveraged to close the deal, it's throughout the sales cycle. We've picked out 5 of Mike and I, frankly, our favorite opportunities to leverage constructive tension throughout the sales cycle. So let's get into them real quick. And as I'm going through them, I'd encourage you to try and relate these back to opportunities you're pursuing right now and how you would apply some of the principles of these throughout opportunities in your pipeline. So first and foremost, setting the agenda for our first conversation. You see, we've actually mocked up what the conversation looks like to make this super clear for folks. So you get on the phone. Good morning, George. This is Karen from ABC Company. Thanks for taking the call. Hi, Karen. Of course. Happy to. With respect to how I propose we spend the time, I'd say 3 parts to our conversation. 1, share what we've heard from the market to compare your current approach to some of your peers. 2, outline what this is costing the average organization. And 3, how you might compare to some of the industry averages. What have we missed that you'd like to add to the agenda? And as you can see, we've demonstrated where you want to be leveraging strategic silence throughout this. So what this does is it's prescriptive. It sets a clear tone and a clear structure for the agenda, rather than asking them, is there anything that we've missed, which would be closed-ended, keeping it very much open to say, what would you like to add that would be better use of your time, and allows them to give their stamp of approval of, no, this is the right use of the next 30 minutes or hour that we've outlined. The second one, which all of us have heard a lot over the last few months, we can't buy right now, we're in reaction mode. To which your response might be, I understand. With all of this uncertainty, I've heard many of your peers say the same thing. I think the important thing to ask ourselves is, what are our competitors doing right now? and deepening that pain to say, what happens if they're thinking more proactively? What will that mean for your company and for you in the long term? Now, once you've asked these powerful strategic questions, let that silence breathe. Let that moment live in this interaction, and be confident in the quality of the question that you've asked. But know and see through this process, you're planting that seed of doubt. Say, what are my competitors doing? That gets them to say, what if they are thinking more proactively than I am? That presents an issue for us. That presents a serious problem. Third, stakeholder has black hole. And what I love about this particular instance is this is actually a scenario that was brought to us by one of you in one of our first webinars. We asked, hey, I've had these conversations. There's a very clear business case. They black holed on me. What do I do? And we talked through what we refer to in Challenger, what many of you know as the breakup email, of what you would say to basically outline the investment you've made and how it's become clear that since they haven't responded, you're going to move on. So this is an actual email that one of you sent to one of your prospects that got them a response an hour later that led to a multi-year $1 million deal a couple of weeks after that. So got the customer to return even after they had tried unsuccessfully through calls and emails and texts to get them to respond previously. So without further ado, here's the email. Arnold, I have left several voicemails and emails with no response. We've been engaging in conversations over 6 weeks now. I've spent numerous hours working on quotes and getting credit approved because I believe in the opportunity that our proposal presents you to save money. However, based on where we have come to this point, I have not been able to identify enough pain for you to want to take action. I'm going to close your file since it appears you've decided against investing. I wish you the best of luck and feel free to call or email if the model you choose does not work out. Best, Alejandro. Quickly, fourth, the customer buying group is discussing features, benefits, ROI. Here's your opportunity to jump in. This discussion we're having right now is a critical one. We're considering what could happen if we decide to do this. Potential ROI, resource allocation, impact on the team. I think the equally important, if not more important question we have to ask ourselves is, what if we don't do this? And being comfortable in that silence to clearly get your prospect, your customer, to articulate not only to you, but to themselves, what happens if they continue on the status quo. And fifth, and finally, we're engaging with a stakeholder who is evaluating us versus our competition. This is our opportunity to truly teach. I've worked a few opportunities like this where there's a key stakeholder, you, that is tasked with evaluating 2 or more potential solutions. What I've seen happen every time is that stakeholder is called last minute into a leadership team meeting to provide an impromptu update. If that happened to you and they asked you to articulate the key differences or differentiators between us and the other providers you're considering, how would you answer that? So what we've done is created a very visual experience for that customer, for that stakeholder to imagine themselves in this very uncomfortable situation. And what we can do is get a clear sense of who the other competitors are in a very strategic way, how they're thinking about it. And undoubtedly, when this stakeholder cannot clearly articulate the differences between us and the competition, we can then give them the key talking points that position our solution very strategically and differentiated versus the competition. And if they ever find themselves in a situation like this, the very first thing they're going to think of is this question that you asked them before they got into that situation. So that was rapid fire. I want to get into some key takeaways and additional resources that Mike and I will talk about now.
All right, thanks everybody for hanging out a little over time, I think, as we normally find ourselves in these situations, Mike.
Yeah, appreciate you guys sticking on. As always, we will hang for an extra few minutes and answer questions, but while we wait for the chat queue to populate with questions as we typically do, wanted to share just a couple more key points here on the screen. Make sure everybody can see it. We switched back to the PowerPoint. John, you seeing that?
Yeah, I'm happy to run through these quickly, and then you could talk through the additional resources. So just to close the loop on this, constructive tension is a positive force that brings energy, builds momentum, and drives decisions. It is not between us and the customer. It is tension we build within the customer and their status quo. And then finally, it can and should be used throughout the entire sales process.
Excellent. And as we typically do, with each webinar in this series, we highlight a few key resources available to many of you guys to Challenger Activation clients through the portal. Again, if you have access, follow this link here, this URL here. If you don't, reach out and check with us. And if you're not sure, feel free to reach us at challengerevents@challengering.com to check. But a couple things I want to point out here that are available in the portal right now. So for each Challenger skill, very tactical resources and tools, we call them skill guides. So for teach, tailor, take control, and build constructive tension, there's a seller skill guide. This is effectively your cheat sheet, 1 or 2 pages, nothing more than that, to keep, print out, post up on your wall, on your desk, just keep as a reminder for the day-to-day conversations you're having, tactics that you can use to build and hopefully, I think, maintain the appropriate level of tension day in and day out. And if you're a manager or leader and you want to think about, hey, how do I make sure I'm reinforcing or at least identifying and then coaching constructive tension in nature across my teams in the conversations that they're leading? We've got a manager coaching guide as well for each of these skills, all the other ones included, but constructive tension specifically, of course. And then I do want to introduce, we're really excited as we've been rolling these out recently. Everybody, of course, is aware of the fact that our webinar series here follows this new tempo framework that we've launched and been introducing over the course of the last several months. With each stage of tempo, we are rolling out these dynamic interactive playbooks. And so we're excited to announce that we just published and launched the Manage playbook last week. And Manage, again, is sort of, it's all about making sure we're driving a buying process forward, making sure we are having the right conversations, leading to outcomes using things like tension to propel momentum and forward progress, and then also managing stakeholders to drive consensus inside these buying groups. Check it out on the portal. If you haven't been recently, it's available. You can go through a large scrolling banner at the top, big bold letters calling out tempo playbooks. Take a look. So now we do have Engage and Manage complete. And so we're excited to introduce that. And then last but not least, speaking of Manage and speaking of engaging customer stakeholder groups and driving consensus, next month is another big webinar, and this is a topic that we've been wanting to unpack for quite some time now. The session we'll be running on November 10th is Mobilize Customer Action with the Right Buyers. For those of you who are familiar with our work on stakeholder management and ultimately building consensus in large stakeholder buying groups and familiar with the work that we published in the Challenger Customer Book, identifying and engaging customer mobilizers is really, really critical in this environment. In fact, if you don't have a strong and influential mobilizer inside the buying group and an organization that you're trying to sell into, some may argue that you don't even have a chance. And so we're going to unpack this. We're going to give you some tips and practical guidance and ultimately a playbook for identifying and engaging the right stakeholders, your customer mobilizer. So with that, let's take some questions. Let's see what's in the chat queue. I'm going to open it up here. A lot of questions around will the presentation be available? So what we do, if you're joining us for the first time, the entire series, the entire replay is available in a new course that will be launched in the activation platform for those who have it, as well as the slides. We are not releasing the entire lesson out there beyond the firewall, but what we are doing is publishing some mini clips from key moments and highlighting key data points and slides, and we'll put that to our public YouTube page. So keep a lookout across the next couple of days, and the follow-up email that'll go out from Zoom here 24 hours from now, we'll have a link to the YouTube page so you can check out some of the clips that we're making available. All right. John, let's see what we've got in queue.
I can jump, Mike. I did see a particular question.
Yep, go ahead. I'm scrolling through a bunch.
Yeah, it's the one that I attached to was, what's the best way to manage tension virtually? I think we talked about a lot of potential tactics. I think folks were looking for the key principle. So I'm happy to take the first swing at this, and then feel free to add anything that I've missed. As we mentioned, the challenge in virtual is that you and I are two-dimensional. And so we're not able to read the same cues as we might be if we were in the same room. And so we are much more predisposed to fill the room with air, to just keep talking. So strategic silence, making the pregnant pause, stopping and allowing for your customer to ask a question, to make a statement, frankly, to tell you they think that you're wrong, that's all okay. So just create those moments and look for opportunities to ask some of those powerful questions that we mentioned. And folks I saw in the queue were looking for examples of some of those powerful questions that we did show or share in the 5 scenarios that we mentioned. I think what I would say is the more visual and the more open-ended you can make the question to really get the prospect, get the customer to feel it, the better response you will typically elicit.
Yep. No, I think it's a good one. Couple more here. So this one, John, I think this is good. The example you showed of the quote unquote breakup email.
Yep.
And just to clarify, that actually was a real email that one of you guys, I'm not sure if the individual's on this call, but joined our first session on prioritizing opportunities in this environment and making sure we're rethinking like where we're spending our time and how we're spending our time, going after the ones that are high potential and being comfortable with disqualifying and cutting bait on the ones that might take a lot of time to pursue and ultimately end up going nowhere. That email led to a legitimate result. Now the question here around that is, hey, John, what's a good method as sort of a precursor to a breakup email? So when you're already working with the customer, very specifically here on some previous projects, maybe they're an existing customer and you're trying to get them to move forward on the next step of an implementation or toward a renewal. What's a light breakup email to kind of essentially light a fire underneath them to get them moving? That's the question here.
Yeah, I mean, the light of fire, I think, as you said, Mike, obviously, I think the word we would circle around is urgency. So it really underscores how critical it is when you deliver true commercial insight, you have quantified your customer status quo. So if we could say to them, you know, from what we understand from our conversations, this is costing your organization $1.2 million. So if you black hole for 2 months, that's a $200,000 cost to the business. So that's the first place I would start. I would literally quantify the time that it has taken for them and the delay, and share that with them to show exactly what it's cost the organization. The second piece of this, when it comes to managing resistance and frankly the change management that goes into selling, is also alleviating some of that resistance. So make it easy for them. So what can we do to accelerate the process for them? Give them tools. Be prescriptive about what should come next. At this point, we would need to engage with finance. Here's some scripting to reach out to them, to talk to your CFO. By the way, as you're preparing for this conversation, in my experience, here are the 3 questions that most CFOs ask when it comes to implementing our particular solution. So balancing urgency through quantifying status quo and alleviating resistance and by being prescriptive to get this deal done.
Love it. Love it. Here's one that it's directed at me in the Q&A, so I'll take a stab at it, but John, feel free to chime in here. So I'm selling HR software, to SMBs.
Okay.
And the gist of the question here is I've had several opportunities in which the contact, and this is an inbound function. So kind of fielding inbound demand, as we talked about earlier, inbound requests for information, taking calls and doing demos for people who are raising their hand and interested in potentially what you have to offer. This person is basically saying here that they're showing up to the call and expressing interest in features and functions that their solution actually doesn't have, which I think is an interesting problem. And the question here is, how do I get the conversation back on track or in the right direction towards things that we do well? So here's the thing. I mean, it could be a couple of drivers here, but they're seeking you inbound demand in this environment, coming from a customer who's raising their hand independently after some research and wanting to speak to a rep of a supplier. They perceive that you help them solve a problem with something that's being put out there in their finding, in their independent research, whether it's on your website or whether it's through a referral or recommendation from a peer of theirs. They're perceiving that you solve a problem that they have. They've identified that problem. So they're on a particular track to solve that problem, and they're trying to pressure test whether or not you've got the features of functionalities embedded in your solution to enable that. The kicker is, if you don't, you have to try to redirect them back to the problem that is worth solving. And that's the crux of commercial insight, right? we are building messages and we're speaking to problems that have a huge cost associated with them on the customer side, but that ultimately link back to the things that differentiate our solutions. If we don't have that connection, it's going to be tricky. So my recommendation would be think a little bit about the truly unique differentiators that your solution has to offer, and then think about or hypothesize what are the problems that your customers are actually trying to solve when they come to you with a request for information or want to learn more about your solution. And if they're connected, great. If they're not, try to get them on the path towards solving that problem that you know exists that they're perhaps not looking to. Hard to do that in a purely inbound environment, I understand, but as much as you can think about the customer problem that needs to be solved and is solved uniquely well with your solution, that's how you can kind of redirect those conversations.
And you know, Mike, I think the thing I would add to it that struck me as you were going through this question is oftentimes we find messaging and frankly language that is used by both the marketing organization and the sales organization really talks about the value in terms of what the supplier cares about. It's supplier value versus true customer value. And as you well know, what we often press organizations on in their message creation process is answering the question of so what. So for your particular features, benefits, functionality that you can't seem to get this prospect or customer to care about, follow that question to its logical conclusion. Ask yourself, so what? Why should this stakeholder in this function care about this particular functionality? When you can do that, you connect the dots for your customer and make it easier for them.
Yep. How about one more? Here's a good one. This is, I think, one of the biggest problems. I think, we saw in the poll, the vast majority of you are responding that this no decision issue is a big issue. It's happened numerous times, more times than we'd like thus far in 2020, where customers are reverting back to their status quo. The other big problem that we're observing, we haven't really touched on it too much today, is customer access. And so this question comes in. I'm a business development manager tasked to sign new business in a very competitive transportation industry. Any advice on prospecting via phone during the pandemic, right? Are there any good sort of intro questions or hooks to engage a cold prospect once you catch them? Remember, you've got 30 seconds maybe to make your case for why they should take a follow-up conversation with you. John, any ideas there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first, we had that whole conversation, that whole session earlier in this series on capture attention by leading with insight that talked through exactly that: email tactics, voicemail, outreach, and that's available again. If you're a client on the Challenger Activation Portal, you can access a snippet. Maybe we could drop that in the chat, Mike, to the Winning the Challenger Sales series, or they could see a short preview of it.
Yep.
But what I tell you, when you're prospecting via phone, and again, it's no secret for folks that are listening, if you have seconds to capture attention, I think our guidance at Challenger is really two tactics: either state a hypothesis or ask a question. That at least associates your name with value. And that's never going to solve for instances where they're running from another meeting, they've got their family calling them. There's a million distractions, especially right now, trying to get someone's attention. There's a lot of real things that are on folks' mind, but it's about changing the perception that your customers have of someone who just potentially, calls them nonstop and is looking to take up time on their calendar versus an individual who adds value to their business and knows their business well.
Yep, absolutely. All right, there's one more comment, then we're going to let everybody jump. But the comment is in response to the question that was just asked from the individual who's in the HR software space and dealing with that inbound demand and trying to redirect to the right problem or the right features and benefits and solution. And Roy writes, doesn't a lot of that depend on meeting with the correct buyer or influencer to start with? So if you're meeting with HR and they're a technical buyer on price only, and that you meet certain requirements, how can you possibly sell a bigger solution to that technical buyer? Absolutely right. And that is why I've pulled the slide up here. It is critically important to ask certain questions that give you a sense for whether or not you're dealing with the right stakeholder to begin with. So when that inbound demand comes from somebody who may or may not be the right buyer, what are some things you can ask them? What are some verifiers of commitment, for example, or verifiers of potential influence that give you an opportunity to go bigger with a particular solution? There are certain things you can do in that initial conversation, whether it's a powerful question or request, to give you a sense of whether or not you've got a mobilizer who's going to help you influence that buying group and drive organizational action toward consensus, or a talker who might have you spinning your wheels. They're expressing interest, but really they don't have the influence or the ability to get anything done in that buying group. So tune in next month, November 10th, as we start to really unpack what a playbook might look like for identifying and engaging the right customer stakeholders, mobilizers in this environment. Thanks for teeing that up, Roy. I appreciate it. I know you didn't do that intentionally, but it was very helpful. All right, everyone. Thank you. John, close us out.
Sounds good, Mike. Let me just thank everyone. I know we often run over time on these, and our goal is if you can and you want and you find value from it, we want to answer as many questions as possible. So truthfully, thank you on behalf of Mike and I for joining. This has been such a fun exercise and a fun series for us. We're looking forward to what comes next. Till then, happy hunting.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe.